Knowledge Products presents The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. The year 1848 was a watershed in European history, a year filled with revolutionary upheaval and promise. It began in Paris. At the end of February, the city rose up against the monarchy of Louis Philippe. The Second French Republic was proclaimed, reviving memories of the Great French Revolution. Quickly, the exciting news radiated out across the continent. Uprisings erupted. By the end of March, much of Europe was in revolt. These uprisings and insurrections were motivated by liberal, democratic, and nationalist ideas and passions, which had been fermenting for decades. They inaugurated a brief time of hope for patriots struggling to bring freer institutions to their homelands. When the dust had settled, however, all the revolts proved futile. Despotism was reestablished everywhere. Meanwhile, at the end of February 1848, a pamphlet had appeared in London, printed in German. It was published by an obscure group, the Communist League. The title of the anonymous pamphlet, The Manifesto of the Communist Party, later changed to the Communist Manifesto, bore the names of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In reality, its author was Marx, an exile from Prussia living in Brussels. Although the pamphlet was lost sight of in the confusion and tumult of 1848, its ideas would eventually produce more profound and successful revolutions than all those that shook Europe to its foundation in that year. Today, 1/3 of the human race lives under regimes that claim to be Marxist. In this presentation, we will sketch the background of Karl Marx. Then we will examine the chief ideas of the Communist Manifesto, supplementing its concepts and visions with material from other works by Marx. Finally, we will trace the influence of the Manifesto upon Marx's later career. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the ancient city of Trier in the Rhineland. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a prosperous lawyer and an official of the law court at Trier. Until shortly before Marx's birth, the Rhineland had been occupied and annexed by the French, permitting many of the institutions and values of the French Revolution to spread throughout Western Germany. Among these reforms was legal emancipation of the Jews, including the Marx family. With the fall of Napoleon, Trier and most of the Rhineland was assigned by the peace treaty to Prussia. The new administration excluded Jews from a long list of professions, including the law. Heinrich Marx, a moderate liberal, addressed a protest to the authorities against these regulations, but it was rejected. Karl Marx's grandfather was the chief rabbi of Trier, and his mother was descended from prominent rabbis, but Karl was converted to Lutheranism when he was about to start school. This was the environment of the young Karl Marx: liberal ideas at home, a repressive regime in public life, and the living memory of enlightened French rule. Marx was a bright, high-spirited student. His daughter later reported he was feared for the ease with which he composed satirical verses and lampoons against his enemies. His high school career was unremarkable, except for an essay written in the examinations of his final year, Reflections of a Young Man on Choosing a Career.
History calls those the greatest men who ennoble themselves by working for the universal. Experience praises as the most happy, the one who made the most people happy. Then we experience no meager, limited, egoistic joy, but our happiness belongs to millions. Our deeds live on quietly, but eternally effective. And glowing tears of noble men will fall on our ashes.
While at high school, Marx was influenced by a neighbor and a friend of his father's, a minor aristocrat named Baron von Westphalen. On long walks through the countryside, the Baron discussed the great works of European literature and philosophy with the eager young pupil. Westphalen prided himself on being au courant of the latest ideas. He introduced Marx to the fashionable views of Saint-Simon, a French socialist with a sizable and conspicuous following in Paris. The Baron's eldest daughter, Jenny von Westphalen, was to become Marx's wife and lifelong companion. At 17, Marx left for the nearby University of Bonn, ostensibly to study law. He was scarcely a model student. He caroused and dueled and was once jailed for disturbing the peace of the night with drunken noise. Like many fathers before and after, Heinrich Marx chided his offspring. Karl spent too much money and never wrote letters home. After less than a year at Bonn, Marx was sent to complete his studies at the University of Berlin. Here, Marx came under one of the most decisive intellectual influences of his life, the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel held the chair of philosophy at Berlin from 1818 to his death in 1831, 5 years before Marx arrived. Hegel's philosophy was a form of German idealism. Although this tradition is rather alien to the more empirical traditions of English-speaking countries, Hegelianism was exceedingly popular in academic circles of Central Europe during the 1830s and 40s. Hegel's major concern was history, not the history of this or that nation or even age, but the history of mankind in the widest and most general sense, universal history. The historical process, he held, is not random or meaningless. It is intelligible and inevitable. It represents the working out of a force, the world spirit, whose aim is a growing self-realization and, at the same time, freedom. The world spirit moves history along a predetermined course, but that course is not straight or simple. At any given moment, there are contradictory elements at work, straining and struggling with each other. This unfolding struggle of opposites, which Hegel called the dialectic, moves humanity on to the next, higher level. The individuals acting on the stage of history believe they are acting for their own purposes alone. In reality, Hegel argues, they unknowingly fulfill the grand design. The real significance of the so-called great men, such as Napoleon, who pursue their own power, lies in furthering the final ends of the world spirit. From Hegel's point of view, then, the great changes of history must occur. They are the logical conclusions of preceding stages. Hegel, you could say, sees history as a locomotive that cannot be sidetracked and whose schedule cannot be appreciably altered. The end of the line is total freedom, which Hegel identifies with rational government and his own Prussian state. Some critics claim that Hegelianism produces an attitude of arrogance, because Hegelians consider themselves privy to the deepest secrets of existence. It also inspires an almost religious awe for what exists instead of for what should exist. Decades after Hegel's death, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche expressed his condemnation of Hegelianism.
It has put history in the place of the other spiritual powers, art and religion, as the one sovereign, inasmuch as it is the idea realizing itself, the dialectic of the spirit of the nations, and the tribune of the world. If each success has come by a rational necessity, and every event shows the victory of logic or the idea, then down on your knees quickly, and let every step in the ladder of success have its reverence.
Once in Berlin, Marx met Hegelians of one stripe or another, and the philosophy attracted him as a way of finding meaning and hope in history. At first he rejected it. Then he wrestled with it. Finally, he surrendered to it and became a convert. Hegel maintained in a famous phrase that the real is rational, and the rational is real. This was interpreted differently by two distinct types of Hegelians, the old Hegelians and the young or left Hegelians. According to the conservative old Hegelians, this meant that what exists at the present time, the real, is rational and therefore right and good. This bolstered the Prussian monarchy. According to the young Hegelians, however, Hegel meant that only what is truly rational is real. Therefore, the present-day absurdities of church and state were doomed to pass away. Marx associated with the young Hegelians at the university and around the city of Berlin. Among these was Bruno Bauer, a young lecturer at the university who developed a Hegelian critique of religion. They became friends, and Bauer advised Marx to pursue a career in philosophy. Various groups of restless young thinkers in Europe believed that great changes are underway. Bauer expressed this to Marx.
The catastrophe will be terrible and must be great. I would almost say that it will be greater and more horrible than that which heralded Christianity's appearance on the world scene.
Marx, hoping for a teaching position, decided to write a doctoral dissertation on the thought of two ancient Greek philosophers, Democritus and Epicurus. A striking feature of this short work is Marx's invocation of Prometheus, the Greek hero who defied the gods and stole fire from heaven to save man from extinction. Many humanistic thinkers have admired Prometheus as a symbol of man's unquenchable spirit and of rebellion against oppression. But under the influence of Hegel, Marx put the Promethean symbol in terms of thought and consciousness.
Philosophy makes no secret of it. The proclamation of Prometheus, in one word, I hate all the gods, is her own proclamation, her own slogan against all the gods of heaven and earth who do not recognize man's self-consciousness as the highest divinity. There shall be none other beside it.
As Marx's thought evolved, several ideas were at its very heart. The inherent majesty of man, his historical degradation by institutions and whole social systems, his coming redemption and installation in his rightful place. For instance, in an article published in the New York Daily Tribune in 1853, Marx discusses the horrors of British imperialism in India. For all the misery the British were causing, they were nonetheless fulfilling a crucial historical function. They were destroying the ancient Indian village system, thus clearing the way ultimately for the liberation of the Indian peasants.
We must not forget that these little communities were contaminated by distinctions of caste and by slavery, that they subjugated man to external circumstances instead of elevating man to be the sovereign of circumstances, that they brought about a brutalizing worship of nature, exhibiting its degradation in the fact that man, the sovereign of nature, fell down on his knees in adoration of Hanuman the monkey and Sabala the cow.
Soon after completing his dissertation, Marx concluded that communist society would be the final vindication of the Promethean spirit of man, not of individual man, but of collective man. Bruno Bauer, who became increasingly outspoken in his critique of religion and Christianity, was dismissed from his academic post. Although now a doctor of philosophy, Marx regretfully concluded that a teaching career was closed to him as well. It is interesting to note the impression that young Marx made on a contemporary, Moses Hess.
He is the greatest, perhaps the only living philosopher who can honestly be called a philosopher. The eyes of all Germany will be upon him. He will be the one to kill off medieval religion and government. Imagine Voltaire, D'Holbach, Lessing, Heine and Hegel united in one person. I say united and not jammed together. This is Dr. Marx.
But Marx still had to find a job. He began writing newspaper articles, the first being a ringing defense of freedom of the press. He began contributing to a new paper named the Rheinische Zeitung, or the Rhineland Gazette. Marx's polemical journalism soon won praises. In October 1842, he was made editor. Marx's editorship was a turning point in his life. The young Hegelian, immersed in the most abstract depths of philosophy, had to confront the actual social world. Issues required Marx to think and take a stand. Issues like the harsh punishment of poor peasants for stealing fallen wood from the forest. Marx's outspoken criticism attracted the attention of the censor sent out by Berlin. He reported,
Dr. Marx is certainly the master of doctrine here, the living source of the newspaper's theories. I have made his acquaintance. He would die for his principles.
Finding it impossible to persuade Marx of the error of his ways, the Prussian government suppressed the Rhineland Gazette. Disgusted with the political backwardness of his native country, Marx decided to emigrate at the first opportunity. He got the chance when a friend, Arnold Rogan, started a new journal, the German-French Annals, to continue the development of the ideas of the young Hegelians. Marx became co-editor. Financially secure for a while, Marx finally married the patient Jenny von Westphalen. While waiting to move to Paris, Marx threw himself into his studies with renewed passion. He reread Hegel, delved deeply into the history of the French Revolution, and was taken with the currently popular philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach carried the young Hegelian dissection of religion to a new level. For him, religion represented a projection of human needs, fears, and desires onto a mythical world created by the human mind. Feuerbach borrowed the general idea of alienation from Hegel, but he sharply criticized Hegel's idealism. It is in the real-life conditions of working, struggling, and suffering that human beings must seek the causes of their alienation. Marx read and waxed enthusiastic. The Marxist synthesis was beginning to come together. In Paris, the fusion would occur. Paris of the 1840s was the city of Berlioz and Delacroix, Chopin and Georges Sand, and Heinrich Heine, the cultural and artistic center of Europe. It teemed with political emigres, Germans, Italians, Poles, Russians, and others. Marx could feel at home here. Above all else, perhaps, Paris was the center of socialist thought. While outside of France, socialism was virtually unknown. In Paris, numerous schools of socialist thought competed for adherents. The socialist tradition in Paris went back to Gracchus Babeuf, called the grandfather of all modern socialists. For Babeuf, the French Revolution had not gone far enough. While it abolished aristocratic privileges and created a society of equality before the law, it permitted the worst oppression of all, that of the property-owning few over the propertyless masses. Babeuf was executed, but he was followed by a whole line of socialist thinkers. By the time Marx arrived in Paris, the alleged faults of modern individualist and capitalist society had been under attack for years. Pierre Joseph Proudhon won a wide hearing for his idea of anarchism. Some socialist revolutionaries, like Louis Blanqui, could count on thousands of sympathizers among the Parisian workers. Marx was greatly impressed.
When French socialist workers meet together, smoking, eating, and drinking are no longer simply means of bringing people together. Company, association, entertainment, which also has society as its aim, are sufficient for them. The brotherhood of man is no empty phrase, but a reality, and the nobility of man shines forth upon us from their toil-worn bodies.
The first issue of the German-French Annals in early 1844 carried articles by Moses Hess, the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, another young German socialist, Friedrich Engels, and 2 essays by Marx himself. One of these essays, on the Jewish question, has sometimes been interpreted and sharply criticized as anti-Semitic. True, this essay stereotypes the Jewish community. What is the worldly religion of the Jews? Marx asks. Petty trading, he answers. Money is the jealous god of Israel. But although Marx was capable of anti-Semitic slurs throughout his life, this was hardly an anti-Semitic tract. The point was rather that the characteristics historically attributed to the Jews were now becoming the characteristics of modern society. Marx's second essay, cumbersomely titled Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, attempted to disentangle Hegel's thought from others who had been concentrating their attack on religion. Marx goes beyond them and attacks the kind of society that makes religion necessary. Here is the passage that includes Marx's famous phrase:
religious suffering is at the same time an expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people.
Typically, Marx follows his analysis with a prescription for transcending the evil conditions. Men should abandon the social conditions that require illusions. In the last pages of this essay, Marx touches on the coming revolution. It will center in Germany, he thinks, and it will be the final, definitive revolution. It will be led by the class that modern society has given birth to, the class that represents society as a whole, the class that can say, I am nothing, and I should be everything.
A class must be formed which has radical change. A class in civil society which is not a class of civil society. A class, finally, which cannot emancipate itself without emancipating all the other spheres of society, which is a total loss of humanity and which can only redeem itself by a total redemption of humanity. This dissolution of society as a particular class is the proletariat.
The German-French annals never went beyond the first issue. Marx remained in Paris, where he experienced the financial distress that would plague the rest of his life. He spent time with a friend of the family, the great German lyric poet Heine, and with prominent social critics and reformers. Marx's friend Arnold Rögel describes him in a letter to Feuerbach.
He works with an extraordinary intensity. His is a fresh talent that lets itself go for the moment in an arrogant dialectic that tries to explain too much. But he finishes nothing. He breaks off again and again and dives once again into a shoreless sea of books.
The subject Marx was beginning to tackle with such fury was economics, or as it was known then, political economy. An essay by Engels had helped to arouse Marx's interest. Marx was already a communist, a believer in the redemptive role of the proletariat. Now, he read deeply in the history of economic thought. The authors included the influential writers of his day, such as Jean-Baptiste Say and James Mill, who were classical liberals, believers in a free market economy. The result of his reading is a work called The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, or sometimes the Paris Manuscripts, which remained unpublished until the early 1930s. The central idea is alienation. Marx applies it to economics, where the condition of the modern worker is manifold alienation.
The alienation of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently, as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power on its own, confronting him. It means that the life he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien.
For page after page, Marx continues in this highly abstract vein, touching on the various aspects of modern society that turn man away from his essential nature as a freely producing being in association with his fellow man. The division of labor, money, and private property are the culprits. An anti-human world, deceitful and distorting in its essence, has been produced. A world that can only be negated by communism. What characteristics of communism enable this?
Communism as the positive transcendence of private property, which is human self-alienation. Communism, therefore, as the real appropriation of the human essence through and for man. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social, that is, human being. This communism is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. The true resolution of the struggle between existence and essence, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and knows itself to be this solution.
These manuscripts remained uncompleted. In a sense, they were Marx's first draft of a great work he would keep trying to finish. Its essence was the integration of economics, as it was understood in the mid-19th century, with the dialectical method of Hegel and the materialism of Feuerbach. In the background was the vision of communist society foreshadowed by some of the French socialists. Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, later said,
"The Marxist doctrine is omnipotent because it is true. It is the legitimate successor to the best that man produced in the 19th century, as represented by German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism."
The summer of 1844 saw another important occurrence in Marx's life, the beginning of his friendship with Friedrich Engels. Although they had met briefly before, they now discovered a true community of mind and spirit. For the next 40 years, theirs was to be the closest possible collaboration, both intellectually and politically. On occasion, Engels would even write articles and permit Marx to publish them under his own name. And Marx wrote works, the manifesto itself, which he attributed to both of them. In time, when Engels' position in his father's textile firm in England became more secure, he was able to help his friend with substantial financial contributions, which both of them considered no more than Marx's due. Engels described their relationship several years after Marx's death.
Both before and during my 40 years collaboration with Marx, I had a certain independent share in laying the foundations of the theory, and more particularly in its elaboration. But the greater part of its leading basic principles, especially in the realms of economics and history, and above all, their final trenchant formulation, belong to Marx. Marx could very well have done without me. What Marx accomplished, I could not have achieved. Marx stood higher, saw further, and took a wider and quicker view than all the rest of us. Marx was a genius. The others were at best talented. Without him, the theory would not, by a long way, be what it is today. It therefore rightly bears his name.
In Engels, Marx found what he badly needed, a man of talent with a particular gift for popular exposition who was in total agreement with him on all major points and in most details as well, and who found deep satisfaction in seconding Marx's own efforts. It was truly one of the great partnerships of history. Their first collaboration was a book titled The German Ideology, a final settling of accounts with the young Hegelians. This book presents the first major statement of historical materialism, the Marxist philosophy of history. Marx and Engels also expanded their network of contacts in international socialism. Their views often clashed with those of other activists in this amorphous movement. Sometimes this led to bitter quarrels, where it seemed that Marx was satisfied with nothing less than the total demolition of his opponent. Marx was never one to suffer fools gladly, and quite often he found those who disagreed with him to be fools. A celebrated occasion in 1846 shows Marx's attitude towards socialists he felt were misleading the workers. Wilhelm Weitling was an itinerant preacher of a vague communism with religious overtones. One day, Weitling showed up in Brussels, and Marx invited him to a meeting to discuss revolutionary strategy. A Russian acquaintance of Marx, Pavel Annenkov, reported the event.
Marx himself was a man of the type made up of energy, willpower, and invincible conviction. With a thick mop of black hair on his head, his hairy hands, dressed in coat buttoned diagonally across his chest, he maintained the appearance of a man with the right and authority to command respect. All his motions were awkward, but vigorous and self-confident. All his manners ran athwart conventional usages in social intercourse, but were proud and somehow guarded, and his shrill voice, with its metallic ring, marvelously suited the radical pronouncements over things and people which he uttered. This note expressed his firm conviction that it was his mission to control minds, to legislate over them, and to lead them in his train. Before me stood the figure of the democratic dictator incarnate. Engels had not yet concluded his opening speech when Marx looked up and addressed a question directly to Weitling. Tell us, Weitling, you people, you have made such a rumpus in Germany with your communist preachings. With what fundamental principles do you justify your revolutionary and social activity? And on what basis do you intend affirming it in the future?
Weitling was thrown into confusion. He rambled on, losing the sympathy of his listeners with every sentence.
Marx interrupted him. The gist of his sarcastic speech was that to arouse the population without giving it firm and thoroughly reasoned out basis for its actions meant simply to deceive it. The color rose in Weitling's pale cheeks, and he recovered his genuine, fluent speech. In a voice quivering with emotion, he began to argue that the man who had gathered hundreds of people together in the name of justice, solidarity, and brotherly mutual aid could not be called a vain and worthless person, that his modest preparatory work was perhaps more important for the general cause than criticism and closet analysis of doctrines in seclusion from the suffering world and the miseries of the people. On hearing these last words, Marx slammed his fist down on the table so hard that the lamp on the table reverberated and tottered, and jumping up from his place, said, "Ignorance has never helped anybody."
Marx disdained revolutionaries who lacked the historical approach, the sense that he alone, or at most he together with Engels, had solved the riddle of history, that he alone knew where the whole great epic of human struggle was heading and how it would get there, endowed Marx with supreme self-confidence. This repelled many in the socialist movement of his time, but on many others it exerted a powerful attraction. The Communist Manifesto is one of the most famous and frequently reprinted pamphlets in history. It is by no means Marx's greatest work. That distinction belongs to Das Kapital, or Capital. But for every person who has read substantial portions of the 3 complex volumes of Capital, there are dozens who have read and been stirred by the brilliant argument and hammering rhetoric of the Manifesto. The pamphlet contains, in an abbreviated form, most of the central ideas that so profoundly affected the international socialist movement for generations afterwards. Lenin wrote of the Manifesto,
"With the clarity and brilliance of genius, this work outlines a new world conception, consistent materialism, which also embraces the realm of social life, dialectics, as the most comprehensive and profound doctrine of development, the theory of the class struggle, and of the world historic revolutionary role of the proletariat, the creator of a new communist society."
The Manifesto had its origins in the Second Congress of a group called the Communist League, a loosely organized association of a few hundred persons, mostly German artisans, headquartered in London. In August 1847, Marx joined his tiny Communist Correspondence Committee, essentially a network of friends who shared views and political information by mail, to the much larger Communist League. The Second Congress of the League was held in late November and early December 1847. Marx traveled to London from Brussels to attend. At this meeting, Marx and Engels dominated. At the close of this Congress, Marx and Engels were assigned the job of composing a statement of doctrine for the League, which could be used for propaganda purposes. The final product must have surpassed their fondest dreams. To assist his friend, Engels passed on to Marx a draft he had written called Principles of Communism, which consisted of 25 questions and answers. As he composed the manifesto, Marx drew on Engels' draft, particularly the section that sets forth a 10-point program for the communist consolidation of power. Still, as Engels himself later said, the manifesto was essentially Marx's work. Occupied with giving lectures and writing articles, Marx delayed completing the manuscript. Under prodding from the London group, he managed to finish it. The Communist Manifesto was published in German in the city of London at the end of February. The Communist Manifesto was divided into 4 sections. The first, bourgeois and proletarians, and the second, proletarians and communists, are by and large the more abstract and theoretical. They form the intellectual core of the work. The third section, socialist and communist literature, outlines Marx's differences with other schools of socialist and pseudo-socialist thought. The last and shortest section makes clear the communist position on dissident parties in some European countries. The first section is preceded by a brief introduction. It opens with these riveting lines.
A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies.
This was more wishful thinking than sound political analysis. The specter terrifying the established powers was that of the combined forces of liberalism and nationalism. Compared to these, communism was a negligible factor, except in Paris. Nonetheless, like an astute political leader, Marx attempted to bolster the morale of his troops and plant doubts in the enemy camp by magnifying the power on his side. At the beginning of Section 1, Marx pronounces one of his most famous lines.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
He goes on quickly to sketch this conflict of classes as manifested in various epochs.
Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight.
These lines are so well known and so striking, and the idea of class conflict is such a recurring one in Marx's writings that many people believe he actually discovered the idea, or at least that he was the first one to use it systematically to explain historical events. Even scholars sometimes refer to any approach that mentions classes as a Marxist approach. It is important to be clear on this. Marx was far from inventing this way of interpreting history. A long line of thinkers in the classical liberal rather than the socialist tradition had made frequent and fruitful use of the concepts of classes and class struggle. Adam Smith, for instance, held that businessmen will sometimes form a class in order to snare privileges from the government to protect themselves from potential competitors. Other classical liberals maintained that state bureaucrats, both civilian and military, comprise a permanent class, which exploits the rest of society through taxation. A remarkably well-read scholar, Marx was keenly aware of these classical liberals. In a letter to a friend and follower, Joseph Wiedemeyer, who was the first exponent of Marxism in the United States, Marx wrote,
Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of the class struggle in modern society, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, 1, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development production. 2. That the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. That this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society.
In the manifesto, Marx develops this theme of the ceaseless struggle of classes throughout history. But unlike the liberal writers of his time, when it comes to modern society, Marx finds an inherent, irreconcilable conflict between the two classes he thinks are eclipsing all the others, the bourgeoisie, or capitalists, and the proletariat, or industrial working class. Marx devotes the next few pages to depicting the rise, triumph, and achievements of the bourgeoisie. This class began in the chartered towns of the Middle Ages and grew along with the expansion of trade and industry that followed the discovery of America and the sea routes to the Far East. This period of early modern history saw the economic base of society revolutionized.
The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed to one side by the manufacturing middle class.
By manufacturing system, Marx means an earlier form of industrial production centered in the workshop. It was much more productive than the previous system based on master craftsmen and apprentices. But it, too, gave way to the factory system. Step by step, with their rise to economic dominance, the bourgeoisie assumed more and more political power.
The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
Later, this view that the state was merely a tool in the hands of the ruling class was qualified by Marx in important ways, but it remains the view of the state most identified with Marxist theory. In the manifesto, Marx proceeds to touch on the vast changes in values, institutions, and the way of life of society that have accompanied the rule of the bourgeoisie. Interestingly, Marx would not disapprove of all these changes.
The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. And as in material, so in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible.
With great insight, Marx identifies a fateful characteristic of the capitalist system. It is an engine of ceaseless change. Marx believes this is due to the need built into the system for continually modifying and improving the instruments of production. This leads to changes within society. Through the quest for raw materials and new customers, capitalism leads to the creation of an integrated world market.
The bourgeoisie compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image.
And, Marx adds, capitalism has led to the rule of the cities over the countryside. In this way, comments Marx, who was a born town dweller, only at home in great cities, capitalism has rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Marx was no conservative, hankering after the lost world of the Middle Ages, as we can see from this breathtaking tribute to the world of modern capitalism.
The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor?
Marx is about to bring the proletariat onto the scene, and with it the coming final conflict and the inevitable triumph of socialism. First, however, he sums up his theory of why society progressed from feudalism to capitalism. This will be the model for the transition from capitalism to socialism.
At a certain stage in the development of the feudal means of production and of exchange, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder.
This is the heart of the Marxist interpretation of history. It is called historical materialism, since it takes the basis of all historical change to be changes in the material productive forces. Historical materialism finds expression throughout Marx's works, but it is presented best and most succinctly in the preface to one of his less important books, The Critique of Political Economy, published in 1859.
At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. That is, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed.
Marx thus distinguishes between three levels of social phenomena. First, there are the material productive forces. Then, the relations of production, which he tells us is equivalent to the property system existing in a society. Finally, the level of ideological superstructure, of legal, political, religious, aesthetic, and philosophical ideas. These ideas fill the consciousness that any age has of itself and of the changes it is experiencing, but they do not determine those changes.
On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflicts between the social productive forces and the relations of production.
Scholars have debated endlessly the precise meaning of the key terms in the preface, because the meaning of historical materialism itself hinges on them. Although there is still a good deal of disagreement, it seems most likely that Marx was saying roughly this: the foundation of social life, the material productive forces, is the technology available to a given society. To this level of technological development, there corresponds a system of property relations, or relations of production. This system, in turn, generates the ideological superstructure, or the whole system of ethical, religious, philosophical, and other ideas and values of a society. For reasons Marx does not specify, the time comes when material productive forces begin to change and evolve. they run up against the resistance of the older, increasingly antiquated property system. This system becomes less able to accommodate the energy and vitality of society's burgeoning productive forces. A snake breaking through its old skin and molting might be an analogy. This clash or contradiction, in Hegelian terminology, colors the whole intellectual life of society. New ideas join battle with traditional ones. This battle of ideas and ideologies occurring on the surface of society is perceived as a social revolution, but its ultimate cause is always the evolution of the material base of society, of its technology. Now, there are numerous problems that bedevil historical materialism. Does technological change occur spontaneously, automatically? If not, what is its cause? After all, the stagecoach did not produce the locomotive. Moreover, do political institutions and philosophical and religious ideas really play no role at all in determining events? How can technology be separated from ideas and consciousness in the first place? In later years, Engels and other Marxists attempted to deal with some of the many problems sparked by the sweeping claims of Marx. Engels, in particular, tried to qualify them by giving a certain weight to non-material factors in social life. Nonetheless, it is clear that much of the potency of Marx's original vision derives from the notion that there are material forces operating to move society from one stage to another, forces similar to the mighty powers of nature. In the Manifesto, Marx maintains that in his own time, the material productive forces have begun more and more to outgrow the system of capitalist property.
Modern bourgeois society, which has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells.
A major example is in the business crises that occur periodically and bring capitalist society to its knees. These crises, Marx claims, are becoming more frequent and destructive, and are signaled by an epidemic of overproduction. That is, productive forces are outstripping capitalism's ability to handle them. These crises spell the end of the bourgeoisie. The dialectic of history, however, has another little surprise up its sleeve.
But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians.
The characteristic of the proletarian is that he has nothing to sell but his labor power. His numbers mount with every advance of the capitalist system. Like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, all other classes of modern society are caught up in the relentless process of capitalist development. Craftsmen and small businessmen who are defeated in the competition with large-scale capitalists swell the ranks of the working class. As the proletariat increases in number, it grows also in the sense of solidarity and in class consciousness. This is no one-way linear development in Marx's view. True to his dialectical approach, the process undergoes reverses and upsets. But after each of these, it reasserts itself more strongly than before. The workers form unions, not to obtain this or that advantage for their particular members, but to aid in the great work of creating a powerful working class, ready to do battle with the class enemy. The very advances of capitalist society in communication and transportation aid the workers in coming together. Now, Marx says, the class struggle nears the decisive hour. Marx held that, in a sense that is not really clear, ideas are determined by the economic environment. In the Manifesto, addressing the writers who might wish to defend the capitalist system against his attacks, he says scornfully,
"But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property."
Different classes produce different ideas. Marx claims there are bourgeois ideas that arise from and serve the interests of the capitalist class, and there are proletarian ideas that arise from and serve the workers. In fact, Marx sometimes acts as if unmasking an adversary as a member of the bourgeoisie is in itself a sufficient answer to his arguments. But there is a problem in this strategy. Marx was himself the son of a lawyer and state's attorney. He definitely came from the middle class. Engels came from an even more affluent background, a factory-owning family. Most of the notable figures in the history of socialism were also from the bourgeois class. So the obvious question is, why did they not share the ideas of their own class? How is it possible for these children of the bourgeoisie not only to exhibit proletarian ideas, but to originate them? Marx attempts to answer the question. This passage is particularly interesting because Marx refers indirectly to himself and Engels and furnishes the reason they have sided with the proletariat.
Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as therefore at the earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat. And in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole.
Marx had in mind men like Lafayette at the time of the Great French Revolution. Lafayette was a liberal who fought for constitutional government and the rule of law against the reactionary aristocrats. Marx says that as the final victory of the proletariat approaches, and at the time of the manifesto he believed it was not far off, the same thing would occur with members of the bourgeoisie. This is particularly true of ideologists, or, as we would say, intellectuals, including Engels and Marx. However, the reason for their change may be surprising. It is not because the ideologists sympathize with the plight of the working classes under capitalism, or from some sense of outraged justice. It is because they have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. This is part of Marx's Hegelian heritage. History is moving through a predetermined pattern to a predetermined end. To be rational means to act in accordance with the requirements of the historical process, to help that process along. To act contrary to the process, to try to swim against the mighty current of history, is irrational, even, one might say, insane. Once ideologists like Marx have risen to where they can see the direction of history, they would be impotent fools, empty dreamers, if they refused to identify themselves with it.